Welcome to another edition of Lexington Remembers. We've specialized in this series, which is now in its seventh year, I guess, and talking with Lexingtonians who either are fascinating in and of themselves and or represent families and are members of families who have shaped this town of ours and helped make it what it is and who've been here for a long time. And it's a special joy for me to be talking with Dan Busa. He and I were colleagues on the Board of Selectmen. I had a great deal of trouble keeping him straight. He was always voting wrong and saying the wrong things. And Dennis, whom Dan says knows his family history very, very well and is very familiar to all of us in the Busa Farms. So, welcome.
Thank you.
We're glad you're here. At least I'm glad Dennis is here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to be here with my old history teacher, Mary Gillespie. I feel more comfortable now sitting next to you that I know that she's with me.
Yeah. Well, you always did need help. Yeah. So, what's going on with you? What have you been doing since you stopped working for the people?
Well, just doing the same thing I was doing while I was working for the people, trying to make a living. Just continuing with the family business, the liquor business, and trying to run that, and brought in our third generation this year. Last year, our sons, my son Andrew and my partner Bill's son Michael Busa, are now part of the organization. So we're third generation in the business in Lexington, and just sort of keep the wheels turning.
When did the wine and spirits business start? When did your family begin that?
Busa Brother Liquors was opened in 1960, December of 1960.
Where? East
At
Lexington?
131 Mass Ave in East Lexington.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At the time, there was an increase in the population of Lexington, and they were made aware of it, and they were in the process building that building on Mass Ave as a commercial rental building that they would own and rent to tenants, and found that there was a license available at the time because of the population increase in Lexington, and they applied for the license, and they were awarded a license.
And is this A&D Realty?
A&D Realty, Busa Realty Trust, I think at the time, who was Alfred and Daniel, my father, and Alfred, Bill's father, and they were in the building business, residential homes mostly, and that particular project was their first commercial property, to be their first commercial property.
And Al, who is also on the Board of Selectmen,
For 12 years, right?
your uncle?
Uncle,
Yeah.
my dad's brother. Yeah.
Okay.
Of 2 of 9 they were.
And the other 7?
Oh, well, for Joseph, Lavinia, who passed away at the age 15, Mary, Romeo, Alfred, Daniel, Eva, Lavinia, number 2, and Anthony.
Okay, all right. And they
I hope
built
that was 9.
I think so.
and they built that they built that commercial building, and then there was a license available, you said.
At the time of the construction, they found out that that was the case, and they made the application to the state, and then they had to petition the town fathers to allow it to be added to the number that were already there, and they were successful, and rather than renting to a tenant, whoever that may have been, they were the tenant.
Okay.
in their own building.
And who else was in town had a liquor store then?
Well, there was Joe Traney, had a
Right,
store in the center.
right.
And then there was another store in the center, which was Lexington Liquor Mart, which was also an Italian family, Luciardi. The Luciardi sisters owned that store. And then there was Vinebrook Bottle Shop, which was next to the old Pewter Pot and DeSells, which was owned by, I think, a fellow named Doran, but no
Okay.
relation to the farm.
Berman wasn't there.
In Berman. Berman's one of the oldest licenses in the town. Joel Berman's grandfather actually started the business, and they started across the street from where they are now in the brick building, which was a bookstore at one time and a hairdressing shop now.
Who Grace was too?
Huh?
Grace TV was? And the fish place?
No, the older building on the corner used to be, was it Bagelman's Pharmacy?
Uh-huh.
That was the original Berman's liquor store. And then where they are now used to be a drive-in food establishment.
Oh, okay.
And it used to have an island that jutted out from the corner of the building and had you could drive up and they'd come out and put the trays on your window and come out and serve you out of the parking lot.
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I remember there was an attempt to establish a liquor store in on the corner of Merritt Road and Waltham Street. And there was a huge objection from some of the neighbors.
That did happen most recently, though.
Huh?
That did happen most recently. They awarded a sixth license in Lexington. There was a family, Diadavesian, who opened up Crushed Grapes.
Oh, yeah, but this was long before
Oh, way
that.
before that?
Yeah,
At one point in time, before
this
The
was in
town-
the 50s. early
Oh,
50s.
well, before the town fathers took a stance of being more business friendly, I was told that by one of the selectmen. There was a strict policy that was established in regard to where the establishments were at the time. This was back in the 70s. And what happened back then in the 50s, I have no knowledge of. But, and so they kind of rezoned, and when they rezoned, they kind of micro-zoned where each liquor license was allowed to go.
Mm-hmm,
But prior to that, I don't know what the
mm-hmm.
brouhaha was.
Well, I was just thinking about it, Dan, because back in the early 50s, there were a lot of people in town who, unlike some of us, looked down on the liquor business and who
Yeah.
didn't appreciate a good martini.
You know,
And I wonder if that's faded away or.
well, I think that was just the mores of the time. The state Massachusetts is funny in their laws; they're very colloquial, you know, even to this day, and especially the alcoholic beverage laws are really today. The laws go back to and prior to Prohibition, but many of them were created during
Did
Prohibition.
Arlington recently become licensed again?
And
They were
like
dry for a long time.
Arlington was without licenses for a long, long time.
Mhm.
They now have 5.
Yeah.
Winchester had no licenses. Belmont had no licenses. So I think that was the just the norm at that point in time. That
So,
Well,
they were awarded very, very cautiously, and I think a lot of the laws and one of the major players in the formation of the laws, even today, was the Catholic Church.
Uh-huh.
The Catholic Church had a lot to do with, because they had such an arm's length relationship with the state government
Mm-hmm.
way back when, that they had a big hand in creating the laws that are on the books today.
Restrictive laws.
Restrictive laws.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that in regards to our industry.
Well, I remember even as late as when you and I were running for the Board of Selectmen, which was what, 93? And you said to me that some people were critical of your industry and
Yeah,
your, you
yeah,
you
you're
know,
gonna get that. I think
Yeah.
you're gonna get that. There's still an element there. There's still, part of the old suffrage movement out there that, don't believe that it's a proper thing to have. And,
Alcohol breeds trouble, no matter where it is,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's why there are very few bars.
Yeah.
Have been.
well, that's true.
Like there are in London and England, you can, there's a neighborhood tavern around every corner.
Yeah.
And we can't have that here because we
Yeah.
can't behave ourselves for some reason.
Mm.
But I guess it's changed. I mean, they had taverns in Lexington back at the beginning.
That's right.
And then they
Of
went
course,
out
and a lot of them
of
too.
course.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did you establish the store up Mass Ave?
On Mass Ave was 1960.
No, but I mean,
Oh, Bedford Street.
yeah.
Well,
Bedford
actually,
Street.
that license was purchased by Alfred Boozer, and it was the old Vinebrook Bottle Shop, which was on Mass Ave, next to the Pewter Pot. And then in 1979, it was moved to 55 Bedford Street,
Mm-hmm.
which at the time was a little old gray colonial home on the corner of Camilla Drive and Bedford Street, next to the Lexington Lumber Company.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Walter Briggs.
Hmm?
Walter Briggs Lumber Company.
Oh, well, yeah, right, Briggs, right.
Mhm. Okay. And then you've got one in Burlington.
Yes, I own one in Burlington. I own one in Reading,
Oh, do you?
yes, and I own one in Westford.
Really?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
And then you got in the cigar business for a
And then we
while.
got in the cigar business. That was a fluke when again, the cigar boom, which came back in I guess it was in the 90s, it
Right.
had a resurgence. And the
Right.
resurgence ran ahead of the government intervention. And so everybody had cigars again. We had a shop, the store in Burlington, we actually built a smoking room
I remember.
inside. I know you remember. And then all of a sudden, the powers that be decided that, well, we can't, this thing's getting, very, very popular. There must be something we can tax. So they decided to implement a floor tax, excise tax on the cigars, and that sort of dampened the sales of it all. But we sort of hung in there with a couple of spots and had
Mhm.
cigars in the
Mhm.
mix.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing better than a nice snifter of brandy and a nice cigar,
Yeah.
I think,
that's-
still.
Yeah. Right.
In moderation.
Yeah, well, I've got my doctor to the point. I haven't got him to the point where he prescribes cigars and martinis, but I got him to the point where he says, I don't think that cigar a day does you any harm.
Right.
So that's progress.
Well, if it makes you relax and lowers your blood pressure,
That's
I know
right.
you're a high intensity guy,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
But before the liquor business, the family was into construction and real estate.
Our family was part of the entire clan, the Boosa family, with Dennis's father, my grandfather, who were in that East Lexington area of town on Lowell Street.
They
And
came into town as farmers.
came
Huh?
They all came into town as farmers. There were four brothers that
Right.
came in around
When?
1919. And came here from Sicily, of course, earlier than that. Dan's grandfather and my uncle Frank were the first to come over in 1906. And they settled in Belmont and Waltham. And then
From Sicily.
from Sicily, and worked at the estates and the farms in that area for a while. Then my Uncle Guy came in 1913, and my father came 1910, and my father came in 1913. When they were teenagers, his grandfather was 18, and my Uncle Frank was 17 when they came here. My father was 17, and my Uncle Guy was 17 when they came here. And they just started working on the farms. So by 19 his grandfather was the oldest. So by 1919, they had found the place in Lexington, and they all got together as under one business. They called themselves Boozer Brothers at that time. And Dan's grandfather was most of the instigator and the catalyst in that. He was the oldest, and along with Frank and the others, they all worked together because they were younger. And little by little, they all got married and had families, and they divided the farm up into different quadrants, and farmed that land continuously since, they started building houses. Dan's grandfather was still farming back into the late 50s and early 60s as well.
Now, why did they come? Those first.
Because we had a very large family there, and there was nothing to do in Santa Stefano, Sicily in the 1890s and early 1900s. You had to move on. At that time, Sicily was a very depressed area. You couldn't really own land. It was owned by the aristocracy at that time, so you worked for somebody else. They all worked on other people's farms. And there was a lot of tension with the labor unions starting up at that time, and I think my grandfather just wanted to get his sons out of that situation into a safer environment, and there was other family members, town members, living in the Boston area around the turn of the century.
Oh, okay, they'd already come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, they came here really around the turn of 1900s.
When was the earthquake?
1908.
Yes, there was a tremendous, devastating earthquake in Messina. And Santa Stefano was just down the road. So the village was really a suburb of Messina, so to speak.
It was a very impoverished area, really. You'd work on the farms, day to day, and then you'd pass on that job to your children. But, he had a lot of children himself. He had about 8 or 9 kids. And like I said, the boys were in danger of getting conscripted into the military at that time, so he wanted to get them out of there. And we're, the best place, people were starting to immigrate to America at that time in droves, and they just joined the train, the boat actually, and came over, and they got jobs here, and they raised families, and they succeeded. It was very difficult to do what they did, but they did it.
Have you been back there? Have you seen that?
I have. A couple of years ago, we went back.
I was there in 2004.
And an interesting side note with the family, Dennis has been doing a lot of research on Ancestry.com, and tremendous work. And I was just through talking to him about this meeting, he put a link on so I could go on and look at the tree. And we're talking like 300 years in that village that we can find.
Yeah. Our
Thanks
ancestors
to-
go back to the early 1700s in that village. And it was a small town. I mean, today it's only 2,000, but I think back then it was a lot less. And the area they lived in outside of Messina, there were 3 towns. There was Santa Stefano, Santa Stefano Medio, and Santa Margherita, within a span of about 2 miles, like from Arlington Heights to Lexington Center.
Mm-hmm.
And all the families lived there, and they stayed there. Even the people in Santa Stefano didn't intermarry with the people down the road from them, but generation after generation after generation stayed in that town. And a funny thing is, when they started coming to this country, a lot of the people from the same town came to this area as well. They lived in Belmont and Waltham and some in Lexington. The same names that I found in the archives in Santa Stefano, I found over here in Belmont. And it's the same families, and they live near each other here. And they intermarried here. His grandfather married a woman from Santa Stefano as well. My father's first wife was a girl from Santa Stefano. My uncle's wife is from a family from Santa Stefano. They stayed together, and that's how they succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a family, they were very close, the 4 brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And they all looked out for each other, and they socialized with each other, and they succeeded.
Yeah, it was all about family and work.
Yeah,
That was
they were
it.
very close.
Yeah. But it was funny on our trip, the first trip for me, and so many of the family members had been through the village. You know, we stopped and we were with two other couples, and we get out in the piazza and in this little parking area, and we started to walk around. And I swear I saw a woman that was like a spitting image of Sheila.
Yeah.
You know, one of our cousins.
Yeah.
And didn't speak any English. I don't speak any Italian. But I said, Busa, you know, oh, America, yeah, let's go. Up we went, up the hill and through the little streets, and we found one of the cousins who was the former postmaster in the town. And you know, you had his front door here and a little garage door there that went up with the sign, post, over the top of the garage. So that was his house was the post office. And he took us out to one of the little cafes and had some espresso and things like that. But they're still there.
Yeah.
They're still there. And,
Not as many as there were before,
No.
because most of the Booses are here now.
right.
But there's still some family members there, and the relatives
Yeah.
are there.
And then on my grandmother's side, she was a Galetta. The small story on the side was that there was a famous character from the Ed Sullivan Show many, many years ago called Topo Gigio. And Galetta, what was his name? Nino?
Well, no, Peppino Mazzullo.
Peppino Mazzullo.
Mazzullo. He was Dan and my father's Dan's grandfather and my father's sister's son.
That's
So he's our first cousin.
he was the voice of Topo Gigio.
Oh, really?
He still lives there. He's still alive.
Yeah.
He's about 90 now,
Yeah.
and he lives in one of the princess's palace. That because like I said, the aristocracy owned most of the land there. But he was so successful with his entertaining, you know, because he was worldwide known because he translated his act into different languages, you know, especially in South America and all over Europe and even Japan. So he became quite prosperous, and he bought the palace in Santa Stefano that he lives in now.
Really?
Yeah, he grew up in a little shack. I have pictures of them during the war where they just were wearing rags, really, and he became quite successful after that. And he's our first cousin.
And we came back down to the bottom where we had parked, and I met his sister, who was still there living. She's well in her age, yeah, and she had a sense she was in tears because more family came from America
They love it.
to
every
visit.
time. Yeah.
And she went into the cupboard and pulled out a photo album, and there's Dennis and his and my uncle and all
Really?
the different
They say
family
that
members that had come, you know, over the years.
a few years before, I think the cousins from Woburn were over there.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right. Kenny,
Bobby and,
Bob, yeah.
and Joe, I think, were there.
Now, you said Belmont and Watertown and Waltham?
Waltham, Waverly, and
And-
Waltham. Yeah.
Why those towns?
I know the whens and the wheres, but not exactly the whys, but that's where people were settling, and they tend to settle where they knew somebody, their friends. Like we were going over the family tree before with a couple of days ago with Dan, and his family's, like his grandmother is named Galetta, but her mother was named Balsama, which is another name from the town. The Balsamas came over into Boston first in the 1880s. And I think that, you know, you have some town people and people that you knew from your town, so you would go there. You would write a letter and say, you know, is there work for me? And I think little by little you'd bring somebody over. When you came to America at that time, it was a little easier than it is now, but you had to declare where you were going and who you were going to stay with. And if I checked all the ship manifest lists, and
Did you?
everybody is back and I'm seeing my cousin in Boston on Dover Street, or I'm seeing my brother-in-law here and there. So I think the Balsamas were maybe influential about bringing everybody over from Santa Stefano. They came here. There's several other Busa families that are not quite in our tree that came over at the same time too. And our grandfather, my grandfather, his great-grandfather, we're a little generation off, came here in 1905 and stayed with his nephew, who was named Bella, but his sister married somebody named Balsama, who was in Danny's family. So they all intermarried, knew each other,
Mhm.
and we were just little kids at that time. I think if we went through this with some of the old timers who were still alive,
Oh.
they would give you the proper story about how everybody got here and why and where they settled. But they worked on farms because that's what they could do. They didn't
Yeah.
speak English or write English very well, and they were all hard-working, self-starting people, and they didn't want to work for anybody else, so they went into business themselves as farmers, which was very difficult to do.
And do you know where in Belmont and
I know
Watertown,
that I have
Walton, those
addresses.
farms were?
They lived off of Beaver Street and Forest Street,
Oh, over in there.
that area.
Okay.
They worked on, that was the Warren Estate where the field station is now.
Mhm.
And the Lyman Estate was there, and there was a few other people. They'd work in the Dean Dairy was down the street in Watertown. They'd milk cows. And they picked up the farming business from their employment.
Mhm.
And they lived at 9 Forest Street with Dan's grandfather, all 4 brothers, and his early young family. He had 3 children and his 3 brothers living with him on 9 Forest Street, which is at the corner of Beaver Street and Forest Street in Waltham.
Mhm.
And Galettas lived in Belmont, which is where he met, Dan's grandfather met his wife.
Mhm.
So they knew each other. There was a network
Mhm.
back then.
And it's funny, today you hear a lot of stories about families coming from other parts of the world, from the Asia and other areas, and they're all, there's 12 in a house.
Mhm.
Well, Dennis did again the research, and I'm reading some of the documents that he's put online. And one of the paragraphs that stood out to me was that in East Lexington there were 22 people living in 2 houses.
Yeah.
Side by side.
They didn't,
Really?
they didn't live in 4 to a room. They slept 4 to a bed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this
Yeah.
way. They lived up in the attic. There was a lot of kids and people in that time. When they bought the farm in 1920, there was 1 house, and they built other houses as the years went by. So the 4 brothers and Antonio, which was Dan's grandfather, who was the oldest, was the first to get married. He had 4 children by that time, plus his younger brothers living in that house. Then they all got married in the 20s. They had a lot of kids and they built another house, but in that small area there was 20 to 30 Booses, family members growing
Now,
up.
where were those houses?
Right next to the farm.
Right on Wall Street.
As you went down Lowell Street, the Reed farm was before
Right,
it. And then
right.
There's a gray farmhouse attached to the
Right.
farm. Then there's another house next to that, and which was built in 1923. And 2 houses down, my father built a house in 1930, and those were built then for the family
Yeah.
back at that
Now,
time.
now
Was it
they bought the
51?
farm.
51 Lowell Street,
52 was the farm. 51 was Monahan across the street.
across the street.
And there was 46 was where he lived, and 38 and 36 was where my father and my Uncle Frank lived. And they all had big families.
And they bought the farm as it is now, the same acreage?
It was
or
12
was it-
acres when they bought it. 12 acres with 1 house, contiguous piece of land.
Mhm.
They bought it from William Shea, an Irishman. Not from Ireland, from Canada, but he was Irish. And they subdivided it as they got older. They subdivided it first, I think, in the 30s. When my Uncle Guy, he had a big family as well as my Uncle Tony, and he had to move he found a place in Woburn to buy, so my father bought him out so he could take his family over to Woburn in 1935.
Mhm.
So it was the same piece of property that basically is still there. I mean, it's different people own it now. I mean, the town owns most of it,
Yeah.
and the Goldingers own Antonio's quadrant up on the hill.
But at one time, as I recall, we went, really, it went from the Arlington Reservoir up Lowell Street to Summer Street, and then from Lowell Street all the way to the Great Meadows.
Yeah, and there was no houses there.
And then there was nothing.
There's a nice aerial photograph that I have, and probably Dan has too, where you can see just farms in every direction.
Right.
Reed was still not quite operating at that time, but they had a lot of acreage. I think Dan's grandfather was renting
Right.
that property.
Yeah.
And across the street, there was a Monahan farm, and
Oh,
just
yeah.
a few houses.
So they would buy property when they had the money to do so, and
Yeah, rent it.
contiguous or rent it, and, you know, they went all the way up to the farm, they call it, I guess, up in Winchester,
Yeah,
by the church. They used to farm up on that hill.
Mhm.
So they farmed, you know, you still were farming on,
yeah. I still farm on
on Waltham.
Ricky's old property
Yeah.
on Waltham Street.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I've been growing corn there for a long time, and then there's Ferrazzani's place on behind Johnny Carroll's driving range.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
about 2 or 3 acres there that I farm over there too. So those are all old farms that I'm keeping going because I need to make a living as well because I live in Lexington. The tax
Now,
rate-
who else had farms? The Cataldos?
Oh, the Cataldos, the Rickies, the Napolis, like we said.
Tropiano.
Wilsons were there. The Daly had a farm. Thanks.
Wright's farm,
Yeah, Daly,
Daly.
Johnny Carroll.
yeah, Carroll's.
Carroll's was a pig farm.
Yeah.
And Dean, there was not Swanson's place.
well, Potter had a pig farm.
Potter. Then there was the Porters down the street from us
Yeah.
on Lowell Street. I could just rattle them
Wilson,
off. I mean,
the other Wilson.
yeah,
Yeah.
Porter Wilson.
Wilson's and.
The Peterson greenhouse is way down where those new houses are now, where Plant Action used to be.
Yeah.
That was then at Fisk, there was the, what was Porter Wilson
Porter
at Fisk?
Wilson. Had the, used
Big
to-
greenhouse range over there.
Yeah.
And then the Millikins, you know, there was a lot of, and Dorans, they had a big farm in the early part of the century. It was, I would say, you know, now there's 30,000 plus in the town, but I think back at that time, there couldn't have been more than 10,000 people. Even when we were growing up, it just started to boom when Dan and I got born. But, you know, before the war, it was very rural right there.
I moved here in '49, and there were a number of farm stands,
Still,
uh,
sure.
Yeah.
and even in those days.
Yeah.
Oh, we forgot to mention my Uncle Angelo on Grant
Right.
Street.
Mhm.
He came over, he was one of the younger brothers, he came over a little later. And he came over on 1925, but I think he bought the land on Grant Street around 1930, and he had Oak Park Farm.
And that was the Saddle Club Road area.
Oh,
back
yeah.
there.
And he was very popular back in the 50s and early 60s.
Mhm.
He had a very nice stand there.
So, the farm was still, now, what's the history of that piece of land? You say they bought it
It's
from
an old
Shea.
it's an old grant from Cambridge, first given to Lieutenant Edward Winship, the man's name was, who came from England in 1636. And he became a councilman and selectman in Cambridge, and I think he won, in order to get paid, they won grants for property. And I think if you check Worthen's maps, that Edwin Worthen did, you know, a lot of history of the early part of the town, and the Winships owned that quadrant of land from the West Cambridge line, which became Arlington, to Mass Ave and Lowell Street. That was all his land, and he owned it and built the mill on just off of Bow Street, behind the liquor store, actually, the Boozer liquor store.
Mhm.
And it was a sawmill at first, then became a fur factory, I think, afterwards. But then he deeded the land to his 3 sons through his will. And the Winships owned it in that family, the present parcel, and little by little they sold off all the other land around there. But the family kept that farm, which was the 12 acres plus about 2 acres across the brook, until the 1890s.
Mhm.
And, you know, so they had it from the 1600s to the 1890s. Then in 1896 or something, I think, or 98, they sold it to William Shea, who was, I think, a vegetable farmer. I think the Winships were more into dairy farming at that time. Grew some vegetables for the animals. But then Shea, I think, was converted it more to a vegetable farm. truck gardens, because it was a big area to supply Boston and Cambridge with food. I mean, especially milk and dairy products and meat, like cattle and pigs and chickens and things like that, because it's, you know, the straight road right into Boston. And a lot of the farms in Lexington and Belmont and Waltham were supplying all the population. And like I said, there was a very competitive and thriving farming community back then. So they bought it from William Shea in, I think, 1919. They bought it.
You know, it's interesting because we did an interview with Sam Doran and Charlie Bowen talking about Lexington before it was Lexington. And Winship shows up
Yeah.
very importantly
One of the
in
first
that
families.
whole
Yeah.
separation from Cambridge. And one reason that the lines were drawn where they were drawn was because who lived where in that area. And Winship had a couple of sons, I think.
He had 3 sons, I think. Ephraim was one of them. I think there's the Mount Ephraim now is named after him. And I think the ones who owned our farm was Edward Winship, and then there was a Samuel Winship.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another big family as well, that the Winships. They started the Brighton Meat Market.
Oh, really?
Yes, the Winship was the same family from Lexington, and some of the descendants from who owned that property started the Brighton Meat Market and started selling beef during the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the Brighton Meat Market and the stockyards got started.
Mm-hmm.
And there's I used to drive by there to go to one of my farmers markets, and I would pass a Winship Street going up to Market Street. So it was from the same.
Boy,
family.
I remember that Brighton stockyard, didn't
Yeah,
it? The
that
wind
was started
was
by the
blowing.
Winships.
Did it smell? I remember them, this is hard to believe, but I remember driving cattle through Harvard Square to
Oh, yeah.
the abattoir.
We don't.
You're just a
I remember
kid.
going to Faneuil Hall Market to sell with the celery truck and everything.
Oh, yeah?
Back in it, yeah.
Yeah.
I used to
That was,
stick me on the back.
yeah, for us, we
You know
were
who would
kids.
drive was the sons that Dan's father's age and my older brothers. Their job was to drive the truck into market at night.
Right.
So they, hitch us up every once in a while and
Yeah.
take a ride.
And we'd go, and the path to the market was Broadway.
Mm,
So
oh,
we'd go
really?
right up Broadway through Arlington, and you could take Broadway all the way up, and it
To
was
Charlestown.
right to Faneuil Hall, right to the Quincy Market, Faneuil Hall Market.
We were talking
I'd stop
also,
at Dairy Queen on the way back, which
Yeah.
is why I went, so.
we were talking also with Sam and Charlie about one of the conditions on Cambridge letting us go in 1713 was that we would continue to pay a share of the upkeep of the Great Bridge, Lardis Anderson Bridge now. And the reason for that was because the only way our farmers could get to Boston to sell stuff was across that bridge. So the tradition of Lexington as a dairy and farming community, and then selling produce in Boston goes way back,
Oh, yeah.
way back
Yeah.
to the beginning.
Yeah.
So then the evolution from farming to construction and real estate.
Well, so,
It happened around the same time as the liquor store did, I think.
yeah, in the 50s, there was, after the war, after the Second World War, there was need for housing for the troops coming home and their families, and my dad, Dan, and my Uncle Al, their family, they all grew up, worked, and stayed on the farm. And for the most part, they all couldn't wait to get out of there. It was not unlike,
It's just
Them trying to-
mathematics, a farm's only gonna make so much money.
Yeah.
And you keep adding people to it,
Yeah.
everybody gets a smaller and smaller piece, so barely enough to support, 9 families that.
So
that's
everybody
coming up.
needed to go, you know, my Uncle Joe, the oldest, went to Weymouth, and he was a carpenter, builder. Romeo went to Ohio, went to college out there, played football, and then started his own plastics business back then. He was one of the first guys in the market back in the 60s that were creating these below mold plastic. And
It's his fault.
huh?
It's his fault.
Yeah, it's his fault. And that's right. But we went, he just had passed away this past fall. We went out to the ceremony, actually in the summer, and then they had a ceremony in November. And they had a slideshow, and their first Christmas, their Christmas tree was decorated with black toilet bowl floats, which is one of his products. And the other was the little honey jar, the little plastic bear honey jar that your honey came in.
Oh, yeah.
So they have a picture of the family standing around the tree with the honey jars and blow mold plastic balls, float balls on the Christmas tree. But since my grandfather was the oldest and they had this dynamic of everyone needing to go and do their thing, my grandfather was in the retirement phase. So, and the brothers, he and his brothers, Dennis's dad and Uncle Frank had, you know, created their own pieces that they each, you know, had as their parcel.
Mhm.
So my grandfather's parcel became the beginning of the area where they built, my father and my uncle built the houses.
Mhm.
And so it was a perfect transition for my grandfather to come out of the farming business into retirement. So they would go to the town, they would subdivide the properties, they would build a home, they would sell it, they'd give him money, they'd do the next. And as they went along, he,
And there was
you
a
know,
big demand for housing at that time.
and there was a great demand for the
Housing
housing at the
sell
time.
houses.
Right, right. So they just moved right up, they created Lillian Road, which
Oh,
was my
yeah.
grandmother's, named after my grandmother, and then Anthony Road, which is my grandfather, and then up the top, Sheila Road, which was Al's daughter, and they actually put in another little small. they did a few
Sheila
other
was
things.
in town meeting.
Sheila was in town meeting for years, long time. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, you know, it was, you know, they were tremendously innovative, entrepreneurial spirits.
Mhm.
They, you know, I wouldn't say that they weren't afraid, but they, you know, they had to make a decision to do something.
Yeah.
Because the farm just wouldn't support them all.
Yeah,
Well, at that
it's-
point in time, but I think all the way back to the beginning.
Right.
You know, the family itself, they've always been able to tackle any type of situation that they were confronted with and make good on it.
Mhm.
So, which is impressive to me, as I'm second generation here.
And, you know, a lot of our families have their own businesses, whether it's Angelo, our cousin, who's a contractor now, or they're in the electrical business, or they're lawyers, or they're, you know, store owners in the liquor business, or other kind of construction. I mean, they didn't want to go work in a factory.
Right.
They wanted to
Right.
have their own business, and that's,
Right.
you know, it took a lot of courage to do that, but they were able to do it.
Now, Wayne,
Wayne, from Dennis's nephew.
Yeah, he's actually my nephew, my older half-brother's son.
and he runs the florist,
He's retired now from that. They sold their land to,
but I still talk to him when I need something.
yeah, he could get it for you.
Yeah.
His father-in-law still has a florist up in, I don't know where they are, up north somewhere, Lowell maybe,
Mhm.
so you can get stuff.
It's like ordering on Amazon now. You don't know where it comes from, but you get it.
Yeah, that's right.
But he grew up in Lexington too, Wayne. He moved up to
Yeah.
Concord with his father back in the 60s. But he was from Lexington originally.
Yeah.
If you bump into a Busa in Massachusetts, there's a good chance they're related to our family.
Yeah.
We have a funny story one time when I was younger, working in the store behind the counter in East Lexington on Mass Ave. You know, we have to, from time to time, check identification to make sure that someone's of age, and
Yeah, they keep checking mine.
well, I can
Will you
understand,
talk to them
I can
about that?
understand that. Well, you know, they've seen you before.
That's the way you act.
Yeah, that's the way, yeah. But this young fella came in and he had actually light hair and blue eyes. And I asked him for an ID and he said, you know, here you go. And he showed me his ID and I looked down and it says Michael Boozer from Belmont.
Mhm.
So there's a whole nother contingent
Yeah,
in Belmont
Yeah,
that was part of this, you know, like, so say his father's or my grandfather's cousins.
second cousins, like there are now. There, we have our children and, you know, that generation is so far separated from the original uncles that came over, they don't know each other.
yeah, Yeah.
His part of the family and my part of the family and my Uncle Guy's part of the family, no, they have cousins in the area, but they're second and third cousins. They wouldn't know them if they were standing
Yeah.
next to each other
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
Same thing happened in, like I said, there were 3 major families that came over from Santa Stefano around the turn of the century, and they were my grandfather's second cousins. But we didn't know them growing up. One lived in Boston, another one lived in Belmont, and they just spread out over the area. They all had
Mhm.
large families themselves. But
mhm,
they're all from Santa Stefano,
mhm.
and they all came here just about the same time. And just proliferated, is a good word.
It's a great story,
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
story,
It's an all
great
American
family
story.
story, great American
It
story.
is, it is.
Town changed much since you were kids here?
Oh, yeah, I guess, and, you know, just, it's grown, you know, and with growth comes change.
And the demographic has changed. I mean, when we were growing up, it was Irish, Italian, and a
Yankee.
few Yankees.
Well, yeah.
And now you have a lot of Asiatic people coming in, and, you know, different parts of Asia, and you have, you know, people moving out that, lived here for a long time, and, you know, it's still making the town strong, but it's just different group of people now coming in.
Yeah. Dick Michelson always says that the demise of the center of Lexington was the Burlington Mall. And it certainly, you know, I remember as kids when you needed to go buy something for a gift or
Yeah.
for anything, you could do all your shopping in the center of Lexington.
Clothes,
And groceries, clothes,
meat,
Market,
hardware,
get your shoes fixed, get a haircut.
Yeah.
2 or 3 drugstores.
lumberyard right up the street.
Right,
And
Right,
we were closer to Arlington Heights, but it was the same
Right.
in Arlington Heights at that
Right.
time. You
Right.
just, when you went to go shopping, you went to Arlington Heights, you had First National A&P, you had a meat market, you had, you know, everything there, clothes store.
Launders,
Yeah, you don't even have to take the
bakers.
hike up the road to Burlington Mall, try to find a place to park and walk through 500 stores and,
Oh, it's hateful,
man, it's a lot different now.
yeah. Yankees pretty much ran the town,
They did,
yeah.
they did.
George Emery, John Nicholson,
Yeah,
Ruth Maury,
yeah.
Alan Adams.
Yeah, I remember a story my uncle would tell about, you know, and it always changes for every generation, but, you know, we see like, you know, the folks that are coming here today are different than the folks that were here, you know, started coming 50 years ago, and when my grandfather and his brothers were here, you know, they had to go and they had to deal with the town
Mhm.
for whatever they needed, permitting or whatever they were doing.
Yeah,
And my uncle or my dad or somebody would go with them because they still had, you know, a little trouble with the English language, and, you know, so there was a communication problem, and there was a, you know, a cultural problem.
There was a lot of prejudice too for them too. They had, which is the main reason that our generation and my older brothers didn't learn Italian. They spoke Italian to each other, but English was spoken in the house.
uh-huh.
So they would fit in
Yep.
a lot better.
Yeah,
And-
they wanted to assimilate. That
Yeah.
was the whole point of being here, and they believed in that. And I remember sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table with my grandfather, having breakfast or lunch or something together, and he'd speak Italian to her, and she'd say, "Tony, stop, English," because of me,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know?
But they didn't, you know, not that they were ashamed to be Italian,
No.
but they knew it was best to be American too at
Mhm.
that time. And they tried to fit in.
Do you suppose they felt uncomfortable and kind of pushed aside by all the Yankees who were running the place?
Well, even though the Yankees were running the place, at the time they came, the Irish were running things.
Yeah.
They were here before us.
Yeah,
They were
that's,
here before the Italians, I should
That's-
say. I'm half Irish, so
Italians did a lot
I'm
of
prejudiced.
pushing. Italians did a lot of pushing back on their own.
Yeah,
Like I
yeah.
said, they
Oh,
were
yeah.
very tough guys. These, our uncle, my uncles, and they knew how to get what they needed.
Right.
They were very
They were,
strong
they were
people.
persistent.
Yeah.
But that was just the way it was. You know, the police force in Boston was all Irish. The police
Yeah.
force in Lexington was all Irish.
yeah,
Arlington, all Irish.
yeah, yeah. So there was a tension between the Irish and the Italians, in Boston anyway, I
I
remember that.
remember a story my mother would tell me about my grandfather, that he must have said it once or twice, I can imagine, but when he first came to Boston, couldn't speak the language, didn't know where to go, was knocked into the gutter with a good right cross from an Irish policeman.
Mhm.
That's where you belong,
Yeah,
you know, don't get out of the way.
yeah,
So they, you know, they dealt with all of that
yeah,
also. So,
Yeah. yeah.
but the earliest farms here were Daly's Farm, Carroll's,
Yeah, Wilson's.
Wilson's, you know, they were here in the mid-1800s.
Yeah, yeah. And they came over to work on a farm or have a farm.
Yeah.
Um,
When my father married my mother, it was like an interracial marriage. He married an Irish girl.
hmm.
I had a couple older brothers who did that too. They married Irish, because that's what they, that's where they were. They were, went to school together, and they knew each other.
That was the integration of the day.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
No busing though.
the tensions in town when you and I ran. And I always thought, Dan, that you and I got along so well, even though you were usually wrong. But we
I was wrong once and you let me know it.
only once.
Because we were honest with each other.
Yeah, well,
There was
we
no.
were fond of each other and respected
You
each other.
respect, well,
and-
you respect your fellow human being, and when you tell the truth, then you don't have to worry about anything. When you tell a lie, you have to remember which lie it was you
Which
told.
one it was, yeah.
So, I think common respect is always the best way to go about things.
Well, I think-
we respected, we may not have agreed with each other's political views all the time, but most of the time we did.
Yeah,
But yeah, when we were involved back then, there was some tremendously radical beliefs that had
Mhm.
developed over a period of time. So,
and there was a lot of we, they
Deal with it.
stuff. And I got whacked around for being a friend of yours, and you probably got whacked around for being a friend of mine. But.
I think you more so than I, because
Think?
I think so, absolutely, because I think a lot of the folks that I would call my constituents at the time respected you,
Mhm,
respected who you were, where you came from. They understood your alliances with different political factions, but you came from a different time.
mhm.
You came from a time when, Democrat, Republican, there wasn't this hatred.
Yeah, well, that's
There was
right.
camaraderie, there
That's right.
was reaching across the table, and you came from a time when you had a fiscal sense about everything that you approached.
Mhm,
Because you came from a time when money meant something
mhm.
to everyone, and I think everybody respected that of you, and no matter who you hitched your political horse to, you still had that respect that you at least would watch out for everyone's fiscal interests
Mhm.
before you made any decisions.
Well, I think that we really did, two of us had a healing effect on some of that bitter tensions in town.
Maybe,
Maybe, yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the town is, much pleasanter place to live now than it was when,
Well, I think it's always pleasant when you're
80s.
not in the middle of it.
well, that's right. That's right. You quit.
I quit. I
Yeah.
had enough.
Yeah.
That's it.
I ran again. I got another 2 years to serve.
God bless you.
Yeah, I know you think I'm crazy. Well, listen, great story. Anything that we haven't touched on that you want to catch up with?
We could be here all day.
We could, yeah, we have to cut it off at a certain point.
But Dennis, you know, he's piqued my interest, you know, it was always seemed to be a daunting task to start that
The family,
research,
yeah.
but he's done a tremendous amount of research, which now has got me interested, and I'm gonna start seeing what I can dig up too, so
Mhm.
it'll be fun. you know.
Well, you know, modern technology, I mean, you can sit in your study in your desk and you can connect, like, I'm looking up documents in Italy, you know, through Ancestry
Yeah,
and through other websites. I've got the birth records of our family back to the 1800s, early 1800s.
Yeah, that's
from-
great.
From where I'm
That's
sitting.
fun.
So you couldn't do that 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
you know.
Well, one of the great things is how much your family has done with the opportunities that
Yeah.
they made for themselves.
Most parts stayed out of trouble, you know.
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And took advantage of what they, you know, with very little assistance, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And there was no government subsidies for farmers, especially Italian farmers back then. There was no welfare system. There was no
Right.
programs that they could sign up for. They just did it. you
Yep.
know.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, they scrimped and saved, and they, you know, stayed within their budget, and they worked hard, which is, you know, very hard.
And with initiative. And,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Great story.
Thanks for having us.
Great story. Thanks, Dennis.